Episode 72, Origen Revisited with Terry Young. Thank you again for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter. I set up a Facebook group called A2Z History Page Group. You can find links in the show notes and on the website A2Z History Page for all the social media and all the various links. You can always send me a good old-fashioned email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. The Agora Podcaster of the Month is the Renaissance England History Podcast by Heather Teysko. This is a podcast that looks at different themes in the history of England. I especially enjoy the shows about the development of English church music, and I think you might enjoy those as well. Now, why are you asking yourself, is Steve going all the way back to Origen? And you're like, he died in 253. You're also like, oh, God, another sidetrack episode. But wait, this is not a sidetrack episode at all. Origen is incredibly important for this current episode and mini-series. Even though Origen died in 253, his influence continued to carry on. Some of what Origen wrote and taught was considered standard orthodoxy. Some parts, though, were a bit questionable even at his own time. Over the course of centuries, pieces of Origen's teachings were pulled out and further developed in ways that would eventually be considered heretical or outside of the Church's official teachings. And even as early as the 600s and 500s, that's bad if you're on the wrong side. So this is why we need to revisit Origen. In the next few episodes, we'll see that Origen was condemned 300 years after his death in that Fifth Ecumenical Council. Today, we have a great conversation with fellow church history podcaster Terry Young of the History of the Early Church podcast. We'll get reacquainted with Origen. Terry did a great series on Origen, so if you really want to do a deep dive about Origen, I would highly suggest you go and listen to Terry's great show. Go and subscribe to it and everything. I mean, I am, and I love the show, and it was really great talking with Terry. And you can find the History of the Early Church on iTunes, Facebook, and wherever great podcasts are listened to. I'll take this as just a quick moment to give you a word about Patreon. There are new Patreon rewards. If you sign up to be a patron on patreon.com/papacy at any level from $1 a month on up, you will receive access to the bonus feed. This feed will have bonus content, as you might suspect, but it will also get you access to all episodes early. That could be a week early, a couple of days, it all depends, but you will definitely get them before the regular feed through an RSS feed that will be sent out to you. So you can go over to patreon.com/papacy to find out about all the other great benefits. Each level, there's 4 levels: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. I bet you can't guess where I got those levels from. Each one of those levels has its own unique reward. So I think you'll find something that suits every budget level and every interest level. Now, a huge shout out goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great and Seth the Magnificent. I want to thank our Constantinople level patrons, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, Yoran, Molly, and Mary Carmen, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine, Richard, and Justin. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip to the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome to a very special collaboration episode. I am Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy, and we are doing a collaboration episode with Terry Young of the History of Early Christianity podcast. Terry, how are you doing?
Doing fine, Steve. How about yourself?
I'm great, and I'm really happy to come together to do an episode on Origen because we were talking about this beforehand, that Origen is the gift that keeps on giving for church history. He's always coming back and back into the story.
Oh, yeah. I think if you were to make a list of the top 5 most influential figures in the early church, I would probably put Origen as number 3 on that list, right after Paul and Constantine.
Oh, wow. That's a exclusive list. Why do you rate him so highly?
It's just that his influence is felt by both in the East and the West. Unlike someone like, say, Augustine, who I would also put on that list. But Augustine's influence is mainly in Western Christianity, whereas Origen's ideas you see permeating in both East and West, often in different and interesting ways.
What drew you towards, you did it in your podcast series, which we'll link to in my show notes, and obviously if people are listening to your podcast, they've listened to it already. You did a big chunk of episodes on Origen. Why did you feel that he needed to have so much time devoted to his story?
A big part of it had to do with the nature of the source material. Um, as I was covering the various major figures in early Christianity, prior to Origen, the Apostle Paul was really the only one that I thought we got to spend a lot of time with and get a sense of who he was. Even think of someone as important like Irenaeus of Lyon or Tertullian of Carthage. Beyond their writings and thought, you don't really know a lot about their lives. We know a few things, but Origen really had a biography. There was real narrative material. You could chart his, not just his writings, but the events of his life out on a timeline. And I'm always drawn more towards events in a person's biography. I just think it's interesting to kind of visualize these sort of scenes in your mind, if you will. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, of course, a major admirer of Origen is Eusebius of Caesarea, and much of Book 6 of his church history it is devoted to telling Origen's life. So that was, I'd say, the first kind of main reason. And the second was, even at that point, I hadn't quite fully read ahead and done all the research for, obviously that I'm going to do when I get to, the 4th and 5th centuries. I knew already that the influence of Origen was going to be long-term and significant. So I felt it was important that we as listeners going on this story really had him in our mind and really understood him well.
Maybe first we'll just set the goalpost sort of his actual life. He was born in 185, so that's really early in Christian history, and he died in 253, which is also very early in Christian history. What was the setting, so to speak, of Christianity at that point?
So it's interesting because Origen's life spans what I think is an important transitionary period for Christianity. In the 2nd century church, Christianity is a lot more underground. It's not well understood. There's a lot of popular prejudice towards Christians. You see this reflected a lot in the writings of the apologists, saying that Christians, aren't cannibals. They're not involved in licentious activities at night or what have you. As you get into kind of the period of the Severan emperors, late 2nd and early 3rd century, that starts to shift. Christianity is still legal and is still subject to sporadic persecutions at the local level. But it starts to become, at least in some pockets of society, respectable on some intellectual level. So Origen, for instance, in his life communicated with both the Roman governor of Arabia and also the mother of the Emperor Severus Alexander, Julia Mamaea. And we're not really sure on the details, but he had either he wrote a letter, he had some interaction with the Emperor Philip the Arab and his wife. So the fact that a Christian like Origen, and there's some other examples we could talk about, could have these interactions with persons like that kind of is a testament to how the status of Christianity was changing in Greco-Roman society, at least somewhat. The other side of it, that's kind of Christianity's relationship to the outside world. Within Christianity, I think as the 3rd century comes around, and you get writers like Irenaeus and Tertullian, the church starts to become more theologically mature. It's sort of gone through its great conflict with the various Gnostics groups and come out of that. And in Origen's particular situation, he's from the Church of Alexandria, which, as you know, despite the fact that it is incredibly important for the history of Christianity in late antiquity, it's surprisingly late to the party, if you will. Antioch, Carthage, Rome, even Jerusalem, despite its being rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, these communities are pretty well established by this point, whereas Alexandria, there's not much in the way of solid information. We don't see the Church of Alexandria interacting a lot with the wider Mediterranean. And it's in Origen time that begins to change with the Bishop Demetrius, who is really, I'm trying to remember who I read this in, but they put it so well in that Demetrius is the first Bishop of Alexandria who is more than just a name on a list.
Mm-hmm.
He's the first.
Yeah, who did say that? Yeah, I know. I read that too. That was a good quote.
I've been trying to track it down. I thought it was in Davis's The Early Coptic Papacy, but I don't think it's there. It's somewhere else. Maybe Friend? Not sure. One of us will track it down at some point, I'm sure. But it sums it up very well. And Demetrius is really the first, bishop in the real sense of the word, as we would think of it, a bishop in that monarchical chief Christian minister, pastor, and priest that we have. And it's a very important transition phase for at least the Orthodox Catholic Christians of Alexandria, because of course Gnosticism had a long history there with Valentinus and Basilides and others, and was probably more established in some respects. So it's an important time. It's a time of transition that when Origen is sort of coming of age.
Yeah, I think that is interesting where that Gnostic phase is ending, but then there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge before you get to, say, Eusebius of Caesarea writing in the early 300s. A lot of theological arguments are going to happen in those couple of decades, and a lot's going to happen in the secular history as well.
Oh yeah, it's it's the on the secular front, it's the end of the kind of classical imperial system. It's Origen's life corresponds with the beginning of the infamous crisis of the 3rd century, the military anarchy that nearly destroys the Roman Empire. And the 3rd century has its own major theological controversies. The issues over modalism, which start in Rome, but then actually spread to Libya in the east. You've got the major baptismal controversy and the Novatianist schism, and probably most spectacular of all is like a decade after Origen's death, you have the whole affair over Paul of Samosata.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do think that it's, in a funny way, the 3rd century is sort of I almost think of it like a tamer preview of what's going to come in the 4th century.
Yeah, the 4th century is going to get interesting.
Oh boy, I am both looking forward to and dreading covering the twists and turns of especially the Arian controversy. That's going to be well, we don't need to get into that today, but
Another Alexandrian.
Oh yes.
I'm wondering, maybe we could talk a little bit about where Origen stood on Christology, since that is such a major issue that's going to come up from about 75 years after his death. Did he write a lot about Christology?
I mean, I guess the answer is sort of yes and no. I mean, a lot of his work is tends to be biblical in the sense that it's focused on expounding upon the Christian Bible. He didn't, as far as I know, I don't think he wrote, like, say, something similar to Athanasius's On the Incarnation, like a doctrinal treatise specifically devoted to Christology. But it certainly is there, and it's part of his work. Absolutely. The big thing with Origen's Christology that would become controversial, I don't think this was really controversial in his lifetime. I think this is an area that later became controversial, is that there's a tendency towards subordinationism, to view the Son as sort of a second tier divinity to the Father. And in that sense, Origen is really, in this, he's really following a kind of a Platonic view of, the one and, secondary cause emanating. Now, I think with, the later, controversy over him that you see in the 4th century, think of the Origenist controversy associated with Jerome and Theophilus of Alexandria, which I have to say I'm not as familiar with that, just because I haven't gotten there yet in the narrative. But from the little I have read, the impression I get is, these guys are writing after the Council of Constantinople in 381. They have the benefit of a century of theological development that Origen did not. And I think there's an anachronism in sort of, Origen expressing his view of the relationship of the Son to the Father in a way that in his day was, I don't think, particularly controversial. I don't know if he's any more subordinationist than Justin Martyr, for instance, and Justin obviously didn't receive that sort of treatment that Origen did. But because of the developments that took place, in the following century, Origen becomes a problem because he's so influential. But I think that it's a tendency to be kind of unfair and not recognize that, hey, the language and clarity that you guys have, Origen didn't have, and in his time it was okay to describe the Son in these ways. A good comparison would be the Council of Antioch, which condemned Paul of Samosata, which did two things that would kind of cause problems in the 4th century. They condemned homoousios, although it's not clear for what. But they also said that the Logos of God took the place of the soul, the human soul in Christ, which would later be, the doctrine associated with Apollinaris and would be condemned. But at that time, in the 260s, that was okay. It was acceptable. It wasn't yet viewed as heretical. And that, I think a lot of that stems from the fact that because the church, views its faith as the eternal truth, it sort of has a hard time recognizing that its understanding and expression of that changes and develops over time. And I think Origen's a good example of kind of a casualty of that.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes from actually Eusebius of Caesarea himself, that this religion had to be basically hatched out of an egg fully formed, and they didn't really want to look at things as an evolving process, or not. I mean, evolving is almost saying like things are changing, that more like a refinement of the theology, that these were really difficult concepts, Platonic concepts, that they were trying to chisel away at and figure out what it really meant. And something that, I mean, like with the Paul of Samosata, you hit an excellent point there. Homo usios bad in 260, good in 325.
Yeah, and Eusebius, you're absolutely right. Eusebius very much has that perspective. He even goes further, because for him, Christianity is the religion of the Logos, and therefore it's the original religion of Adam, and it's the religion of the patriarchs, and everything else, Judaism, paganism, is all later. Now Eusebius, of course, recognizes that the coming of Christ is a seminal event in history, but he's writing his history with an apologetic intent to show that the Christian faith has been unchanged since the beginning. And I'm not one of those people that would go so far as to say, well, this movement of this Galilean prophet evolved into this Greek Latin thing that doesn't resemble it anymore. I think that's going way too far. But
Yeah.
Eusebius, on the other hand, kind of like you said, wants to see it as hatched out of an egg, and there's just no way that you can not see. There's clearly development and refinement and clarity, and as the Christian faith is sort of building itself, if you will.
I think it's also he set the parameters of what religion is. Over here is Judaism, and it lives in its own village over here, and it's its own distinct thing. And later on, here's Islam, and it's its own thing. And then that there's a certain amount of blending that these religions had because they were in such close proximity. It makes it uncomfortable when you're talking about that these things all have to live in their own silos.
Yeah, and even before Eusebius, I think of an apologist like Aristides of Athens, who I think he divides mankind into kind of four groups: Christians, Jews, barbarians, and Greeks/Romans. And wanting to have that very clean, borderline, nice, neat identity, I think both, from a historical point for Eusebius was important, but I think also in his own day, the importance of Christian distinctiveness remains important, even if the reality on the ground is, sometimes and often more mixed. I wouldn't go so far as some to say, like, Judaism and Christianity, for instance, were indistinguishable until Constantine or something like that. I in some sectors, I think that could be the case, but in others, I don't think that was such. But that question of distinctiveness and identity, yeah, I think very important.
And he was also playing in that Greco-Roman mindset that there was a lot of taxonomy where things had to be neatly ordered.
Oh yeah, and I think that Eusebius, even during his first sort of historical endeavor, which I think is the Chronicle. He's the first universal historian. He's tabulating all these national histories and kings lists and trying to match them all up and delineate, okay, here's the rulers of the Babylonians, here are the 7 kings of Rome, and here's where they all fit together on this nice, neat grid, and here's where the biblical timeline lines up with that and what have you. and wanting to have everything ordered and structured and flow. Um, and he's living in a time when that's becoming more important. You know, um, you know, Constantine onward, Constantine decides to grant the mainstream church, Catholic Orthodox Christianity, benefits, and therefore his government subordinates have to be able to tell, okay, is this guy, in Carthage, are you a Donatist or a Catholic? Because if you're a Donatist, I don't have to give you, these nice benefits. Your clergy don't get exempted from the curial councils, but if you're Catholic, you get that benefit.
Let's talk a little bit more about Origen's career. He started out in Alexandria and he was educated in Alexandria. He was also of a Christian family as well. What was his family background?
So I don't know quite what I think they were of a decent means, at least initially. His father's name was Leonides, and he was martyred in a pogrom that took place. So it was a local persecution. And as a result, the government confiscated his family's wealth. And so he kind of had to step up and take care of his mother. And I think he had 6 or 7 siblings. I forget off the top.
Right. Yeah, it was a big family.
Yeah. Which, given the standards of living in the ancient world, I'd have to think that, those him and his siblings were the lucky ones that managed to.
Yeah, that's true.
But and so he starts to support himself as a grammaticos, teacher of Greek literature and rhetoric and what have you. And of course that's when he first got noticed by the Church of Alexandria.
He was really highly educated in both Christian education and in classical education. That was a pretty standard item for many scholars in that day, Christian scholars, wouldn't you say?
Yes, you definitely see, and there's clearly a bringing together of both reading and understanding, Christian and biblical literature, but also traditional Greco-Roman literature, the standard classical education, and the ability to harness both of those well, in Origen's case, served him pretty well. And that's something, you continue to see right on into late antiquity with, someone like Gregory of Nazianzus.
I think that that's probably where, how you mentioned earlier that people say that Christianity was the Galilean who gets steeped into a Greek Greco-Roman paganism. These Christian theologians were really describing things with hypostasis and physis and all these different Platonic terms. That's how people talked in those days. When they're talking about the physical world, I think that that's where maybe people get that idea from.
Yeah, I think there's this. I think there's an unfortunate tendency to go to sort of two extremes when it comes to the early church's interaction with Greek thought, because I've sort of seen some people go as far as to say, well, kind of like what we're describing, if the early church fathers embraced Greek thought and classical literature, then they're accused of corrupting the original Jewish faith of Jesus and his apostles and introducing these kind of foreign Hellenic concepts. I've also seen people go the other way and say that, if the early church fathers, if they rejected classical culture and thought, then they're accused of being, anti-reason and causing the Dark Ages.
Yeah,
they just can't win, unfortunately. But I think from its inception, though, I mean, Christianity, the New Testament is written in Greek. The Septuagint is, for the earliest Christians, the Bible. Many of the earliest Christian communities, the heart of those communities really comes from communities of Hellenized Jews. And the idea that Jesus is Judea was some insular Semitic island that was completely unpenetrated by Greek culture is nonsense. I think it's just, we should not have an either or mentality. I think a lot of, Origen included, a lot of the early church fathers were discerning and critical readers of Greek literature, of recognizing, its value, but also recognizing that, their own scriptures and tradition had to be the sort of framework that it was filtered into. When we, we'll get into kind of some of the more controversial aspects of Origen's theology. I think in probably the most is his view of creation, which perhaps represents I think one of his less successful attempts to reconcile Greek thinking with biblical concepts.
Maybe let's finish off his actual career and his life. He dies in 253, but he had a pretty interesting couple of years before that. He wound up moving from Alexandria to Caesarea in the general Levant area. So, I mean, not a big jump maybe in mileage terms, but it's actually a pretty big jump in as far as ideas go. Why did he go from Alexandria to the Levantine area of the Mediterranean?
So he first sort of left and kind of toured the wider Eastern Mediterranean around 215 when the Emperor Caracalla massacred the citizens of Alexandria because they made a play insulting him. And he became, friends and acquaintances with many figures, but especially the bishops of Caesarea and Jerusalem. I want to say the bishop of Caesarea, Theoctistus, I think that was his name. The bishops of Caesarea in the 3rd century all have names that start with Theo, so I think it was Theoctistus, though. And then Alexander of Cappadocia, who was the bishop of Jerusalem. So he kind of established patrons there. He also, at some point, he converted a Gnostic named Ambrosius to mainstream Christianity, and Ambrosius became his patron, supporting him. He was also, eventually ordained a presbyter in the Church of Caesarea. What really caused the permanent move from Alexandria to Palestine was his break with Demetrius. So Demetrius had appointed Origen to be the head of the catechetical school of Alexandria, which was designed to teach converts, who were in the catechumens who were in the process of converting to Christianity. And Origen was in charge of that, and there were kind of two sections. There was a sort of basic, general, elementary kind of section, which he eventually put under his student Heraclius, who later became Bishop of Alexandria. And then Origen kind of taught the more advanced students, which was really kind of his own circle, his own school. Now, the reasons for the break between Origen and Demetrius are kind of hard to recover because the sources are so biased. If the sources are friendly to Origen, then they paint Demetrius as this jealous, insecure bishop who's threatened by Origen's popularity, and he wants to control the catechetical school. It's too independent for him. He's only recently started to become the monarch bishop, as it were, so he wants to assert his authority, and therefore he uses things like the Theoctistus ordaining Origen a presbyter, or letting Origen speak as first a layman in church, giving a sermon, which was not the custom in Alexandria, but in Palestine that was common. And when Origen was young, he had, because he was also teaching female students, he made the rather headstrong decision to castrate himself. And as it turns out, most Christians didn't really approve of that. So if the sources are bias towards Origen, they tend to paint Demetrius as kind of a villain that bullied Origen out of Alexandria. On the other hand, if the sources are hostile to Origen, they view Demetrius as someone who is valiantly defending the church from the pernicious influence of Origen's heresy, that Demetrius is keen and recognizes the threat Origen represents to the true faith, and he is totally justified in excommunicating Origen and forbidding him to return to the Church of Alexandria. So what actually happened is kind of hard to figure out. I think the truth probably is somewhere in the middle, although I don't know how much Origen's theology was an issue at that point. I think the controversies over his theology that occurred in his lifetime come later. So I tend to at least lean a little bit more towards it being interpersonal, not taking a side and saying Origen or Demetrius was the bad guy or good guy in this. But it just seems, long story short, it was a fallout with his bishop.
Yeah, it sure does seem that way. And you got to think that even at that point, there's still not a ton of Christians. It's a small community. They're tightly knit. And if you have a falling out with the bishop, your avenues of your career choices are going to be fairly limited in that place.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, he had to travel as far. He had to change provinces. He had to change his whole home city. There just wasn't, that many other Christian communities in Egypt. There were some, but not certainly not as many as there were later.
How did things go for him in Caesarea and in that in Palestine?
Really well. It seems that he had the total support of his local bishop and the local the wider Christian community in Palestine. They kind of fully accepted Origen and his approach to teaching and thinking. They made sure he was well provisioned. He had his patron, his library. They officially recognized him as a presbyter. They really just kind of brought him in as one of their own, and seemed to have viewed him with, deferred to him and looked up to him as a man that they really recognized as wise and truly spiritual.
He has his career there, and he winds up getting caught up in the Decian persecution. That's the first really big persecution of the church, like empire-wide persecution. Was it more intense in certain areas than others, like the later Diocletian persecution?
Yeah, the persecution of Diocletian's easier because our sources are so much better, and we know among the tetrarchs the different policies are sort of adopted. Under Diocletian and Galerius, they were very gung-ho and zealous. Maximian was sort of gung-ho and zealous, and then Constantius thought it was just a cruel waste of time. The Decian persecution, our documentation is not as thorough. We've got reports of persecution from Africa, Rome, Alexandria, the Levant, as well as Smyrna, which is interesting. But it's possible that the British proto-martyr Alban died under Decius. We don't know. Unfortunately, it's hard to, other than maybe Rome, just because, it was the imperial capital. It's hard to know if any particular province was affected worse than any other.
this Decian persecution's a little controversial. Well, not controversial, but if you listen to certain modern scholars like Candida Moss, they say that, she says that the persecution was really overblown by the early Christians. Where do you stand on that? And feel free to punt on this issue if you want to.
Oh no, I think it's a good question. On the whole, if, works like Candida Moss, I think they're responding to a caricature, and therefore it, because there are dozens and dozens of fictitious martyrdom accounts that are just total fantasy. But that's not really a serious. I think it's it's an overreaction to an overreaction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What I have seen in the case of Decius is some historians argue, because Decius, of course, didn't issue a law outlining Christianity. Christianity was already illegal. Nor did he actually issue a law, as far as you can tell, specifically aimed at Christians. What he actually did was he issued a law requiring that all subjects of the empire, except Jews, offer sacrifice, and that there be official documentation to record this. The empire was on hard times. It was the crisis of the 3rd century. And so, like a traditionally minded Roman, he thought that they had lost the favor of the gods. And so they, if all his subjects performed the central act of worship, offering sacrifice, this would appease Jupiter and the pantheon, and Rome would have divine favor restored to it. So because of that, I have seen some historians say, well, the persecution of Christians was just sort of unintentional. It happened by accident. It was sort of like, well, we forgot to, this group was so small, it didn't even occur to us that there'd be this whole portion of our population that would be not be able to comply with the edict. I don't buy that because, going back to what pointed out at the beginning of our conversation, the early 3rd century Christianity becomes more mainstream. If Origen is interacting with governors and members of the imperial family, I don't buy for a second that Decius was just ignorant of the existence of Christianity and the problem this would cause. I don't think suppressing Christianity was the main goal of his edict, but I think it was an understood corollary, that, well, if we're going to restore the favor of the gods, of course we need to force the Christians back to the religions of their fathers. That wasn't the main goal of his edict, but it was certainly part of the design.
I think also that number of the tiny minority gets overplayed a lot too. It's not like, say it's under 10% at this point of the population of the empire. It's not like that's 10% evenly spread out through the entire empire. You have certain places that are a lot more concentrated than other places, and that changes the whole dynamic.
Oh yeah, definitely. It is not an even spread. I would probably say, the most Christian areas are the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, Rome, parts of Greece, Anatolia. The least Christian areas, I would say, are a lot of the northwestern provinces.
The far west.
Yeah, Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Spain, much of Italy, the northern Balkans, Illyricum. Not surprising that Diocletian and Galerius were from Illyricum, least Christian areas of the empire. So yeah, it's not an even spread, not by any means.
Yeah, let's talk about how he's taken soon after his death, and then we'll move on from there.
Well, I mean, obviously, some of the controversy over his theology started in his own lifetime. And at least in my research, it seemed there were kind of 4 main areas that kept coming up from his time onward. Do you want me to get into those just yet?
Yeah,
Or
let's talk about them.
okay. Well, we already kind of talked about the Trinity, and in his time and shortly after that, that wasn't really an issue. That only later became an issue. Um, the the three other ones tend to be his doctrine of creation and the pre-existence of souls, his view on the resurrection, which is kind of tied to that, and then his belief in what sometimes gets called universal salvation, although that's it's a little misleading because it
Hmm.
conjures up kind of modern Western understandings of universalism. Um, but in Greek, the word is apokatastasis, is the term, the sort of restoration of all things. So I think that his view on creation is probably the biggest controversial point, and he outlined this in On First Principles, his sort of major doctrinal work. And essentially, his critics viewed him as capitulating too much to Greek and Gnostic understandings of creation, in the belief that that matter is inferior to the spiritual, that the physical world is essentially not part of God's original creation. So in Origen's schema, the fall of humanity, the sin of Adam, it's not it's not a fall into death, it's a fall into materiality, that everyone everyone existed at the beginning as a pre-existent soul, and when sin entered the world, those souls fell into physical bodies, so to speak. So the skins that God gives to Adam and Eve in the garden, that's not clothing to cover their shame, it's their physical bodies. And I do think on this point, Origen's critics, I think, have a fair point. There's just no way to reconcile that with what you find in the the writings of the Christian scriptures. There's definitely a consistent idea in both the Old and New Testament that the material world is part of God's creation. It is good initially, and this spills over to Origen's view on the resurrection, which he had a hard time with, especially with his Greek mind, that the eternal state was to be glorified in a physical body. And there are places where he does sort of describe the resurrection and downplays the physicality of it so much that you could say that he's denying the physicality of it altogether. On this point, I don't think he actually went that far. It's understandable why the way he describes it and his apparent uncomfortableness with it, why his critics could very easily twist his words to say that. And again, it reflects this tension between biblical and Greek concepts of God and creation and what the relationship is between them. So I'd say and that just that general view of matter being inferior to spiritual, not really part of God's original creation, is sort of, more than anything, that seems to be the central thread through all the different controversies over Origin.
Is that also maybe why he wanted to view the Old Testament more allegorically? Because there's a lot of stuff in there that's very carnal and it's very material, and to try and elevate that would fit into that sort of worldview.
Yes and no. This I thought was very interesting, because on the one hand, that is why Origin essentially takes such an allegorical approach, is because on the surface, some of these very specific Hebrew laws about dealing with clothing or dietary restrictions, it doesn't seem to be anything spiritual. There doesn't seem to be anything religious about that. Now, we today would just look at that and say, well, that's just an ancient Near Eastern law code. Why are you trying to, make it say more than it is? But for Origen, he just thought, well, this is the Bible. It's from God. It's got to mean more than that. It can't just be at the literal level. There's got to be something higher than that. And that's why allegory played such an important role. Now, interesting enough, he never throws out the literal meaning of the text, and by literal, I don't mean debates over the Genesis creation story, what have you, but the historical grammatical meaning, kind of what we today would interpret a text to mean. Mm-hmm. Joshua conquered this city. We interpret that not as a symbol of Christ destroying sin. We see that as this is an account of this Hebrew leader, attacking
in the Bronze
enemy
Age,
city, whatever. Right. He never dismisses that entirely. He even actually put a lot of effort into trying to understand it. So he interacted at Caesarea a lot with rabbis, and he had a close Jewish Christian friend he just called him the Hebrew. He kept his name secret because Jews who converted to Christianity were often physically attacked for doing so. So he kind of had to keep them confidential. But he recognized very quickly that there's just a lot, especially in the Old Testament, because it comes from the world of the ancient Near East. I mean, it's pre-Alexander the Great. I mean, it's a very different world, even for them at that time, that there's just a lot of material in there that unless you understand sort of Semitic culture, you're just going to be spinning your wheels trying to figure out some, what some of these passages mean. So he did put a lot of effort into interacting with, I mean, going so far as to try to, as best he could, even learn Hebrew. I mean, a lot of that had an evangelistic purpose. He wanted to determine what the correct text of the Bible was to establish common ground between him and Jews that he was trying to win over to Christianity. So I did find that very interesting, that he never throws out the literal meaning, but he always views it as secondary. Again, it's kind of like this view that matter is not quite worthy of God, that it's kind of on the lower shelf, and the allegorical or spiritual meaning, that's the higher meaning, that's the more important interpretation of the text.
You brought up that issue of universalism, and that even brings Origen. People quote him to today of saying universal salvation, but it isn't exactly what, like you said, what people in the Western mindset are made it out to be. What did Origen think? What was he, in his own words, saying?
Yeah, so people today, when they bring up universalism, they kind of mean that as, well, no one has to go to hell. Everyone can sit on a cloud and everything will be fine, kind of thing. And Origen, of course, didn't have quite such a cartoonish theology. For him, it was sort of beyond that. It was the restoration of, because all souls began as pre-existent souls in the pre-matter creation, so all souls had to be restored to that original state. It was kind of part of his grand vision and understanding of how God was working in the cosmos. Now, interestingly enough, so he sort of had this view that because of that necessitated the that even those who were beyond Christ would be redeemed ultimately in the summit of history, as it were. Now, interesting enough, that kind of Origen was also a big advocate of free will, because you would kind of think that an idea similar to universal salvation or something like that would kind of run counter to an emphasis on free will, because you almost think, well,
how does that add up?
Flash forward 100 years. How exactly is Julian the Apostate going to be restored? Kind of thing. I'm just pointing out Julian as sort of, that's a guy that you would sort of think, well, he's clearly chosen where his commitment is, sort of how would Origen square a person like that with his system. And I don't know if he, I'd have to read more. I'd be curious if he ever addressed that directly. Now, one area where he, in his lifetime, what made this controversial is he was alleged to have said that the devil, Satan, would also be restored, that Satan would also have salvation, which even people who might not have any other axe to grind against Origen, that got people's attention. Even the Church of Rome, for instance, all the way west, when they heard that, condemned that. I think, at least from what I've read, that he did not actually believe that. This again ties back to his free will. What he was arguing against were Christians that he thought were sort of being simple-minded and saying, well, the devil is just evil and bad, and that's why he is damned and what have you. Taking what Christ says in the gospel about the devil has been a murderer, sinning from the beginning. And what Origen was saying is that the devil is damned because of the choices that he has freely made, not because of something inherent to his nature, because that would sort of, go against Origen's understanding of God as merciful and just. But it's sort of, so I think what he actually said is the devil is damned by his choice, not by his nature. But I think that was twisted to saying, oh, the devil isn't inherently evil and damned, therefore, he's going to be restored and made good again, which I don't think Origen actually believed. Although I think he did believe that demons, evil spirits, would be restored. So it's not clear too that exactly what happened, but at least in my own reading, that's kind of what I've come away with.
I think that's a good way to jump into Origen after his post-mortem Origen, where he's being misunderstood in his lifetime. And we'll see in your podcast and in my podcast as well that throughout the ages, he's going to be interpreted in different ways. We don't want to give away all the beans right here about what happens to him, but he doesn't fare well in a couple of different church councils, and especially in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. What maybe we should talk about, he's kind of the first early church father to have this sort of treatment done to somebody who dies a martyr and is completely within the church in his own lifetime, but then his reinterpretation gets him kind of cast out, but not, I use that word really specifically too. He's kind of cast out.
Yeah, he has an afterlife that's almost a second biography in its own right. Now I will, I have to admit, this is, as far as his condemnation at the Fifth Ecumenical Council under the Emperor Justinian, that's not something I know quite as much about. I know a little bit about it. I think it stemmed primarily from the fact that his ideas, as they had for a long time, were influencing monastics at the time, and that this, if I understand correctly, was having a detrimental effect on Justinian's attempts to unite the Chalcedonians and Monophysites. Is that correct?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Maybe
it's I'm still in the process of wrapping my mind around it. And he wasn't, the way he was condemned, it was in a after document that the later popes didn't even know about. So it wasn't really in the main section, but he was lumped in with a few other people who had lived a little bit after him. Theodore of Mapasuestia, Ibis of
Danse.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one other person,
Theodoret of Cyrus's, at least the writings that condemned Cyril, right? Yeah.
And the 3 chapters. Yep. Those were 3 other ones. I feel that this was one of the first times at this Fifth Ecumenical Council where people who were completely orthodox become unorthodox way after their lifetime.
Yeah, it is strange, because you brought up a good comparison of Diodore of Tarsus and Theodore of Mopsuestia, who, uh, from what I understand, they were among the quote unquote fathers of the Second Ecumenical Council. Like, they were part of the late Nicene movement with the Cappadocians. And for them they're later condemned because they're perceived as being the origin of Nestorianism, which I don't know enough at this point to judge whether that's fair or not. I think what kind of makes it even stranger with Origen is that no one ever adopted or seems to have adopted his system like wholesale. It tends to be piecemeal.
Mm-hmm.
You see facets of Origen's ideas in different places. And of course, the traditional way to discredit a group of ideas, to label them as a heresy, is you name the heresy after the supposed heretic founder, Marcion, Montanus, and therefore it's no longer Christianity. It's not the teachings of Christ. It's the teaching, the heresis of this guy here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Origen gets fitted into the mold of that traditional heresiology. I think the first person to actually do that to him is Epiphanius of Cyprus in his Panarion. I know he's got a section in there on Origen and Origenism. And of course, he was living in the later 4th century when, controversy in Egypt and Palestine among monastics over Origen was starting to flare up.
You know what I think is interesting about Origen? If you take some of the other people who were, say, condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, they still had a following outside of the Roman Empire, even within some quarters of the Roman Empire. So you could see how their texts kept getting copied and how we can get them today. I never saw anything how did Origen keep getting copied? How did he not wind up in the dustbin of history by just not being translated to modern times?
I think a lot of it is through people like Rufinus of Aquileia. At least as I understand, a lot of Origen's writing survives not in the original Greek, but in Rufinus's Latin translations. And Rufinus had a tendency to be a little carefree in his translations and kind of smooth over areas where, by the standards of his day in the late 4th century, Origen may not have been quite as orthodox as maybe he wanted. I think Origen had a lot of dedicated admirers. Eusebius, Rufinus, who were major mainstream figures within the church. At least, the Antiochians, of course, had followings, to the east in the Church of Persia. But of course, the Western Church, I think particularly North Africa, just completely balked at Justinian's attempt to condemn the 3 chapters. So I think, at least my understanding is, a lot of Origen's work survives in fragments, quotations, and Latin translations.
I have one question for you. Your podcast is sort of bookended with the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Is some of that have to do that the Fifth Ecumenical Council is it's almost a political affair?
Not quite. I mean, the reasons I've chosen Chalcedon as my endpoint is mainly because the story of the early church becomes much more disjointed afterwards, with the breakup of the Western Empire and then in the West, and then the Christological controversy and schisms that result in the East. We sort of lose a central protagonist to follow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the listening to the history of Rome, there's a state-centric perspective. When you really boil it down, Mike Duncan's podcast, he's chronicling the Roman state primarily. So you have kind of a fixed entity to have a central narrative built around. And I think after Chalcedon, that becomes a lot harder to maintain. So that's been the main reason why I've selected that as my kind of cutoff point.
Yeah, it really is difficult. Even within the papacy, there's a lot of decades of popes, one pope after another, and they're just fumbling around trying to find a political entity to latch on to, because you need an emperor and you need a pope. And for a long time, there's just the emperor in Constantinople isn't great, and the local leaders aren't great, so they're trying, and then there's a split politically of who they should follow, and that's a big part of the development of the papacy. But it's definitely a difficult story to tie into a cohesive narrative.
Oh, definitely. I mean, just the unique and very different history that that the popes of Rome experience in the West, and their relationship with Constantinople is very, very different than the Eastern churches.
As we're wrapping up, you did a lot of research on Origen. What are some of the sources that you might suggest that people look up if they want to do a little deep dive on Origen themselves?
Yeah, so the first source I would kind of recommend is by Joseph Wilson Trigg, and he has a book on Origen in Rutledge's Early Church Fathers series. This is really a great series because the first half is biography and an introduction to the both the history and thought of an individual early church father, and then the second half are modern excerpt translations of their various works. So you really get the best of both worlds. You get a nice, relatively brief but meaty introduction to the individual, and then you get a sample of their actual writings. So I think that's probably the best place to start. He also has a full-fledged study and biography of Origen called Origen, the Bible and Philosophy in the 3rd Century. And then another English biography I used was by Henry Crozel, Origen, the Life and Thought of the First Great Theologian. Now, I should point out both authors are pretty sympathetic to Origen, especially Crozel, who just really admires Origen a lot. And then another source, of course, is Eusebius's Church History, which is, of course, the common source for a lot of what you and I talk about in our podcasts.
And a lot of the things you can even find on him, if you do a little digging, you can find them pretty cheaply or even free.
Oh, yeah. The whole Ante-Nicene Fathers series from the kind of, I think, late 19th century, I think, translations were done. That's all available free online. Probably the best place would be Christian Classics Ethereal Library. I think they have kind of done the best job at putting that content online. And I mean, it's older text, older translation, so obviously, if you're doing a real serious study, you probably want to get more current text, but you can get On First Principles, and one of his other major works we didn't discuss, Against Celsus.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one. And also Henry Chadwick has a full translation of Against Celsus as well, which I'd highly recommend that. I know we didn't really get to touch on it, but that's a great work. It's just a fascinating read for a lot of reasons, and Chadwick's introduction is excellent.
Well, thanks so much for working with me and collaborating on this episode, because I love talking about early church fathers, so that works out well. If people out there want to learn more about your podcast, how can they find you?
So you can find us in the iTunes or Google Play Store, History of the Early Church. There's also the blog site, History of the Early Church, .wordpress.com, and then the Facebook page, facebook.com/Early Church Podcast. And then, of course, the email address for the podcast, historyoftheearlychurch@gmail.com.
And if you want to find out more about the history of the papacy, I have a website, a2zhistorypage.com, and you can find all the Facebook and Twitter there and all that good stuff. And if you search for History of the Papacy podcast on iTunes, it should show up. On a good day, you never know with iTunes what'll happen when you try to search for something there. It's been great talking with you.